In a quiet supermarket parking lot, something cruel was about to unfold. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden light over the rows of parked cars. The usual hum of daily life surrounded the lot. Shopping carts clattered as people hurried to complete their tasks, heads down, barely aware of each other. At one of the far corners, tucked away out of sight for most, a homeless man sat on the concrete, his back against the curb. He held a cardboard sign that read, "Help me." Simple, yet desperate. Beside him, his loyal companion, a dog with a patched-up coat, lay quietly on the ground, watching the surroundings with watchful eyes. The man stroked the dog's fur occasionally, offering comfort in a world that rarely gave any. This was the story of an unexpected bond, one forged in the toughest of times. The man, battling homelessness, had been alone on many cold nights, feeling like the world had abandoned him. But that was before the dog appeared. On the coldest night, with nothing but the streets to keep him company, the dog laid down beside him. It didn't bark or make a fuss. It just stayed close, offering warmth and an unspoken promise that he was not alone. That act of kindness changed the man's life. From that night onward, the dog was not just a companion. It was the reason he woke up each day with the strength to continue, despite everything. Together, they carved out their own little world in that corner of the parking lot, isolated from the bustling chaos of the rest of the world. They were invisible to most, but they found peace in each other. However, that peace was about to be shattered by an unexpected cruelty. The roar of a motorcycle engine pierced the air, turning heads in every direction. The sound grew louder as it approached, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath, knowing something was off. The motorcycle came to an abrupt stop, and the biker stepped off, his heavy boots clicking on the pavement as he walked toward the homeless man and his dog. The man looked up briefly, but his eyes quickly dropped to the ground, not wanting to engage. His grip on the cardboard sign tightened, as he instinctively moved to shield his dog. The dog, sensing the approaching threat, let out a low growl and stood its ground, positioning itself between the biker and the man. "No, what's the matter, dog?" the biker mocked, bending down slightly to face the animal. "You think you can scare me? Going to defend your worthless owner?" He sneered, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. The man's voice was barely a whisper, his words full of desperation. "Please, just leave us alone." But the biker wasn't done yet. His expression twisted with malice as he stepped closer, threatening to kick the dog. The dog instinctively backed away, but its defensive posture only seemed to fuel the biker's anger. "Look at this," the biker said, laughing cruelly. "A mutt, defending a piece of trash like you? You're both in my way." Just as he raised his foot to kick the dog, the crowd went silent. A firm voice cut through the tense moment. "Enough!" Everyone in the parking lot froze, their eyes turning toward the figure walking calmly toward the scene. It wasn't just the sound of the voice that commanded attention. It was the presence of the man who spoke. The crowd parted slightly as President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed simply in dark clothes, walked into the parking lot, his gaze steady and unyielding. His steps were measured, but there was something about him that made the air around him shift. Something powerful, something authoritative. The biker spun around, momentarily stunned, his gaze locked onto President Traoré, trying to size up the man who had interrupted his display of dominance. The president's presence seemed to fill the space, and his calm demeanor only intensified the tension. "Do you think this is right?" President Traoré asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. He was looking directly at the biker, not with anger, but with a steady resolve that made the biker hesitate. "Who the hell do you think you are?" the biker spat, trying to mask his surprise with arrogance. He took a step forward, puffing out his chest. "What's this? Another lecture from someone who thinks they know better?" The crowd, which had been silent until then, was watching intently, phones raised, recording every second of the encounter. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand," President Traoré said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about you or me. It's about what you're doing to them." He gestured toward the homeless man and the dog, who was now sitting protectively by its owner. "Those two shouldn't even be here," the biker growled, clearly irritated that anyone would question his authority. "Maybe they have more strength than you realize," President Traoré replied, his gaze unwavering. "You think hurting someone who can't defend themselves makes you stronger? Or does it just reveal who you really are?" The biker faltered for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He looked around, trying to find some way to regain control of the situation. But the pressure was mounting. The crowd was watching. Phones were recording, and for the first time, the biker realized that the situation was slipping out of his hands. The biker's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. He stood there, his chest heaving with anger, eyes darting from President Ibrahim Traoré to the homeless man and his dog. He was still trying to assert control over the situation, but the words from the president were starting to sink in. The crowd had grown, and now even the people who were initially indifferent were beginning to shift their attention toward him, watching closely. "You're just another guy," the biker snarled, trying to regain his bravado. "What do you know about me? You think you're better than me just because you have a fancy title?" He gestured wildly, his voice laced with bitterness. President Traoré didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, calm, and unwavering. But there was something in his eyes that made the biker hesitate. "I don't need to be better than you," he said quietly, "but I do know that what you're doing is wrong." The biker's posture wavered for just a moment. He looked at the homeless man, who had lowered his head, his hand still gripping the dog, trying to shield it from the impending threat. The dog, however, had stopped growling and was now looking up at the biker with steady, unwavering eyes. It was a silent challenge, a challenge the biker wasn't sure he wanted to face. "Listen to me," President Traoré said, his voice firm but without anger. "What you're doing here is not just cruel. It's weak. You're hurting someone who can't fight back." "What does that prove?" The biker, trying to mask his uncertainty, raised his foot again, but his hesitation was palpable. His eyes darted to the dog again, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt passed across his face. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in even closer. The once boiling tension seemed to hang in the air, ready to explode into something much bigger. The homeless man, despite his fear, couldn't help but lift his eyes just slightly to look at President Traoré. He could feel the change in the air, like a small spark of hope. He had lived through years of hardship and pain, but he had never imagined someone like President Ibrahim Traoré would stand up for him, for his dog, for something that seemed so small but meant everything to him. President Traoré stepped forward once more, his eyes locked on the biker. "You have a choice here," he said, his tone still steady. "You can walk away. You can make this right. But hurting them won't solve anything. It only makes the world more broken." For a moment, it seemed like the biker was going to back down. His hands shook, not with the physical effort of holding the bottle, but with something deeper. His anger was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion, self-doubt. The words of President Traoré were starting to chip away at the hardened shell he had built around himself. "You don't understand," the biker said, his voice quieter now. "You don't know what it's like. I didn't ask for this life." "I don't know your story," President Traoré replied softly. "But I do know that what you're doing now won't change your past. It will only add to your pain." The biker let out a frustrated breath, and for a moment, the whole parking lot was silent. Even the dog seemed to recognize the shift as it stood its ground, not retreating, not backing down, just watching the biker with an unflinching stare. The tension continued to build as the biker's fingers twitched on the bottle. But then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a short, sharp laugh. "What? You think you can fix me with your speeches?" he spat, his voice shaking but trying to mask his vulnerability. "Now, what do you know about real pain?" President Traoré didn't answer right away. He took a step closer to the biker, and this time, he didn't speak with anger or frustration. He spoke with calm understanding. "I don't need to fix you," he said softly. But I can show you that there's another way. A way that doesn't involve making others suffer." The biker paused, his grip on the bottle slackening slightly. His face, still twisted in frustration, showed signs of cracking. The people around him, the onlookers, all sensed the change in the atmosphere. Something was shifting, and for the first time, the biker's power over the situation was slipping away. At that moment, a voice cut through the tension once more. It was the security guard, who had been watching the interaction carefully. The old man, simple in appearance but with a commanding presence, stepped forward again. He hadn't said much up until now, but his presence had been enough to deter the biker from escalating further. "Drop it," the security guard called out, his tone deep and steady. His eyes were locked on the biker, unblinking. "Now!" The biker froze for a moment, the bottle still in his hand. The tension was so thick it felt as if time itself had stopped. The crowd stood still, waiting, holding their collective breath. "Do it now," the security guard repeated, his voice unwavering, and that was it. The biker's resistance crumbled. He dropped the bottle, the loud clink of glass hitting the asphalt echoing through the parking lot. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief. The biker stood frozen for a moment, his hand still hovering where the bottle had been just seconds before, But now he was staring at the ground. His body trembled, not from physical effort, but from the internal conflict that had been stirred within him. His tough exterior had cracked, and for the first time in a long while, the anger, the frustration, the hatred he had built up over the years was being challenged. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't say another word. His eyes didn't leave the biker, but there was no need for further confrontation. His message had been clear. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or louder. It was about recognizing that the true strength came from restraint, from showing compassion in the face of cruelty. The crowd, once filled with whispers and murmurs of unease, now stood in silence. Some had their phones out, capturing the moment, while others simply watched, holding their breath. It wasn't just the spectacle of the confrontation that had captured their attention. It was the transformation that was unfolding before them. For the biker, the moment felt like a wave had passed over him. He stood there, lost in his thoughts. The harsh words of President Traoré echoing in his mind. His grip on the bottle had loosened, and now he found himself unable to move. It was as if the weight of his actions had finally dawned on him. Keanu Reeves' voice, calm and unwavering, had broken through the layers of anger and frustration he had held for so long. The biker had been forced to confront his own demons, his own struggles, and for the first time in ages, he couldn't hide behind the mask of arrogance. The people around him weren't afraid. They weren't intimidated. They were watching, but they weren't judging. And that's what made the difference. The homeless man, still kneeling on the ground, glanced up slowly, his eyes filled with cautious hope. He had never expected this, never imagined that someone, let alone President Ibrahim Traoré, would stand up for him, for his dog, for something so small, yet so significant. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. The dog, who had been silent up until now, slowly stepped forward. It sniffed at the biker's boots, and for a moment, the biker simply stared at it. The defiant bark from moments earlier seemed like a distant memory now. The dog, in its quiet but firm way, had communicated its stance, and now it stood with its head held high, as if in acknowledgement of the victory that had just been won. "Are you okay?" President Traoré's voice was gentle as he turned to the homeless man, offering him a hand to help him up. His tone was sincere, free from any pretense. The man took his hand with gratitude, his eyes welling up as he nodded. He couldn't find the words to express what he was feeling, but in that moment, he didn't need to. The simple act of kindness was enough to convey the magnitude of the change that had just occurred. The crowd, still standing in awe, began to applaud softly. It was a quiet sound, but it carried with it a deep sense of respect. The biker, who had been the center of this moment, was now shrinking away, his face a mix of confusion and shame. He hadn't expected this outcome. In his mind, he had been the one in control. But President Ibrahim Traoré had turned the tables without ever raising his voice, without ever needing to. The security guard, who had been an observer up until now, gave a satisfied nod, his arms still crossed as he watched the scene unfold. He had seen countless altercations in the parking lot before, but never one quite like this. The power of restraint, of compassion, had won out today, and it had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. "I'm sorry," the biker mumbled, his voice barely audible. The words were directed at the homeless man and his dog, but they felt empty, as if they couldn't fully make up for what had just transpired. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began to walk away, his motorcycle engine roaring back to life. But this time, there was no arrogance in the sound. It was quieter, subdued. President Traoré watched him go, his expression unchanged. He had done what needed to be done, and now the situation was resolved. But the impact of this moment would linger for much longer than the biker's departure. "Take care of him," President Traoré said, turning to the homeless man. "He's not just your friend, he's your family, and that's worth protecting." The homeless man nodded again, his voice too choked up to speak. He clutched the card that President Traoré had handed him earlier, a card for the veterinary clinic. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. This was more than just about saving the dog. It was about preserving the dignity of someone who had been overlooked by society for too long. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their murmurs turning into soft conversations as they walked away from the scene. The story of what had just happened would travel with them, and though the situation had been brief, its impact was profound. For President Ibrahim Traoré, it was just another day of standing up for what was right. For the homeless man and his dog, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they were seen, where they mattered, and where kindness could still change the world. As President Ibrahim Traoré turned and began walking away from the parking lot, the sound of his boots against the pavement was the only thing that could be heard. The crowd had mostly dispersed, their whispered conversations a mix of awe and contemplation. Some people still had their phones out, recording videos of the confrontation that had just unfolded. It wasn't just the bikers' humiliation that had captured their attention. It was the way President Traoré had acted, the calm authority he had projected, and the compassion that had underpinned everything he did. From the moment he had stepped in, he had been more than just a leader. He had been a force of change, a reminder that kindness and strength could coexist. And it was that very moment, that quiet but powerful exchange, that was beginning to change the lives of more than just the homeless man and his dog. As President Ibrahim Traoré walked toward his car, a few people hesitated before approaching him. Their voices were tentative, unsure, but there was a respect that couldn't be ignored. "Sir," one of the onlookers called out, "that was incredible. You really changed everything." He turned toward the young man who spoke, his face still calm but with a small, knowing smile. "I didn't change anything," he said simply. "The change was already there. It's in all of us. We just have to act on it." The young man stood there for a moment, a little unsure of how to respond. His eyes seemed to brighten at the words, though. President Traoré had a way of speaking that made the ordinary seem extraordinary, and people who were just bystanders in life began to see that they, too, had the power to make a difference. As he got into the back seat of his car, President Traoré reflected on what had just happened. He had been to countless places, faced countless challenges, but this small moment in a supermarket parking lot had been one of the most defining of his life. He wasn't just leading a country or overseeing important matters. In that instant, he had led by example, showing that true power wasn't in authority or dominance, but in compassion and understanding. Meanwhile, back in the parking lot, the homeless man was slowly getting to his feet, his dog still by his side. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him either. His life hadn't been easy, and he had learned to fight for survival in the harshest of environments. But today, he had been a witness to something powerful, something that made him feel like he wasn't invisible after all. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the card President Traoré had given him, a card that represented hope. He wasn't sure what would happen next. The future was always uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he could see a glimmer of possibility. The simple act of kindness, a gesture that most people would have overlooked, had opened up a world of opportunities for him and his dog. He had never imagined he would receive such compassion from someone as important as President Ibrahim Traoré, and that small act was something he would carry with him forever. As the homeless man stood there, he noticed a few people who had gathered around, some still filming, others just standing in silence. A woman approached him cautiously. Her voice was kind, but there was a subtle hesitation, as if she wasn't sure whether she should interfere. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. "That man, the biker..." The homeless man looked at her, his eyes still heavy with emotion. He nodded. "It's okay now. Thanks to him," he said, pointing in the direction where President Traoré had gone. "He didn't have to do that, but he did." The woman smiled softly. "You're not alone. You're not invisible." Her words, though simple, made the homeless man feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in a long time.